Welcome back to another edition of Going the Distance Live. I'm your host, Brandon Hudgens. This week on the podcast, we have my friend Ben Wilson on. Ben is a play-by-play sports broadcaster, as well as a fellow vasculitis patient, as well as a fellow young adult ambassador. This week on the podcast, he and I talk a lot about our journeys as patients. His is certainly unique. As you may start to learn from some of these podcasts here, almost every patient story is unique, and I find it helpful to share those stories. We can all find threads of truth and threads of in common that we all have, but certainly everybody's journey to diagnosis and time after diagnosis is different. Ben's got a very interesting story that I think can resonate with a lot of people. He's certainly been somebody that has been a dear friend over the last several years. And I'm excited to have him share his story with you guys and how he's kind of chased his dreams despite having this crippling disease that, like me, attacks something that's very important to his dream. As always, the intro music this week is recorded by none other than my brother, Tyler Hudgens. Enjoy. All right. Boom. All right. It said recording on my side.
Yeah, and it's funny.
Red light.
I see.
We've got the red light, and we are back with my dear friend Ben Wilson for round 2 of this. We'll be honest with the audience. We had some technical difficulties with my ability to press the record button on Friday this past week. So Ben and I are going to have this conversation again for all of you lovely people. On the podcast this week, we've got my dear friend Ben Wilson. Ben, like my other 2 first guests, is a fellow young adult vasculitis patient that I met at the 2017 International Vasculitis Symposium. Since then, he's been kind of a pillar of the Vasculitis Foundation's outreach program with young adults, and been a dear friend of mine, and been part of a core group of us that have been had to lean on each other in some hard times. So welcome, Ben, and thank you for doing this again.
Hey, it's my pleasure. I'm impressed that you just rolled out of bed yesterday and ran a 4-minute 3-second mile, just kind of nonchalant, not really having to train for it. I mean, I don't think I've ever run a sub 8-minute mile in my life. So, I give you all the credit in the world for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah. So for those of y'all that aren't aware, we had the victory mile yesterday on Saturday, April 25th. If you're listening to this sometime in the future, we did it kind of to celebrate. There's no races right now because of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So everybody's kind of moved to virtual online races. Generally, I've been part of the last summer starting some local 1-mile races here in my hometown in High Point, and we can't do that right now. So we decided to have what we call the Victory Mile to kind of, get out and push yourself. That looks a little different for everybody. For some people, it's a brisk walk around the block for a mile, and for some psychopaths like me, I decided to see what kind of fitness I had been able to hold on to after not training very hard for the last 6 or 7 weeks. So I rolled out of bed yesterday and ran a 4:04 or 4:05, depending on if you look at my GPS watch or the stopwatch that my videographer / business partner who filmed my endeavor. So Yeah, it was a lot of fun. We were actually able to raise a little over $900 last time I checked for the Vasculitis Foundation. So I was super pumped about that. The race was free for anybody that wanted to participate, and we're definitely going to look to do some more here in the future. Maybe we can even con Ben into getting 1 mile in himself.
Well, I will say, and as a sports broadcaster, I can confirm there are no sporting events going on in the U.S. So I'm guessing that you and your camera crew, that might have been the highest rated thing we saw outside of the NFL draft, which really doesn't count if we're being honest. It's just a bunch of names being picked out of a hat, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 300 or 400 views I got on Instagram probably was definitely the highest rated sports show or sporting event on the internet on Saturday for sure.
You're officially an influencer.
Had to be more than the Nicaraguan soccer match that you called yesterday from. Did you do it from your mother's closet again or your parents' closet?
Yes. So for people who don't know, while there are no sports going on, I have still been broadcasting through this company that does all remote broadcasts, and I'm based in Las Vegas, but right now with nothing really going on there, I am staying at my parents' house just north of San Diego. And so with the setup we have here, the really only closed area I could go into is actually my mom's closet. And so there's some nice padded clothes, I think, that allow for a nice little ambiance and a sort of studio-like recording setup. So I've been doing these broadcasts remotely off my laptop from my mom's closet, and I'm proud to say that, Brandon. I'm also doing the same thing with our podcast today.
Are you still wearing your mother's robe?
Again, the fact that we're on a podcast gives me a little leeway here, but let's just say that the robe it's been a staple of the wardrobe. I've been reading, I've been seeing all these pundits on TV. They've just been going, from the waist up, and I'm wearing the suits with, who knows what below. And I'm like, you know what? I really don't care. I don't have to be on camera for these broadcasts. So I'm going full robe, but I will not be wearing that when we record. We're doing some promotional stuff for the VF with Awareness Month coming up at the start of May, and I will spare the people and not wear the robe for that, so people don't have to worry.
Yeah, I recorded some stuff for them too, and it actually made me shower for the first time and do my hair and makeup.
I appreciate your honesty, though.
No, I've been exercising every day, so I do have to shower. I don't like being completely disgusting, but yeah, it was interesting seeing your studio. Ben gave me a tour of the studio, his home studio, after our failed recording on Friday, and it's a nice little setup. Probably a little nicer than even my office that I have that I do these podcasts from. A little jealous. A little jealous. So Ben, why don't you, one of the reasons for having you on the podcast is, to have you, kind of share a little bit about your story. And I think every vasculitis patient story is obviously unique, and, people have, a lot of things in common. And then a lot of times there's other things that are very unique to each person's story. So why don't you kind of give everybody the overview about your journey to a diagnosis, and then kind of what that looked like. You were, as I've kind of already spilled the beans, you were a young adult when you were diagnosed. Also a pretty active young adult. I know you don't want to give yourself credit, but as far as being somebody that was active and fairly fit and taking care of themselves, as much as a college student can at times. If you would just kind of like take us through that process of what that looked like for you, and because for most people, it's not a short road. It's not going to the doctor one time and getting a test and they're like, oh, you've got vasculitis. Like, here's some drugs. Take this Z-Pack and some Tylenol, and you'll be better in 5 days.
Yeah, I guess the span from first symptom to actual diagnosis for me was about 15 months. And of course, it's funny now, having been introduced to more people within the community that are young adults, it's at least you provided the ability just to see that there are a lot of people out there who've had a similar path to mine. But of course, at the time when you don't know anybody, you kind of think like, all right, who else can know what this feeling is like? Because for me, I was 19 when I had the first symptoms, and then 20 when I was eventually diagnosed. And so it was something that started as, and as you mentioned, I mean, I was more lucky than anything, just thanks to good genes, to have really never been sick or not had a whole lot of issues growing up, despite playing a lot of sports. Some people are getting hurt all the time. I never broke a bone or anything, so I really had never had any issues. And throughout when I played different sports in high school, and that continued in college, added FIFA player to my ledger, Brandon, of my expertise of sports. I'm not sure if that really counts, but when I was in college,
esports might be the most popular thing right now. I mean, colleges are adding esports. So
no, you are right. I say that only, I guess, only half joking, and I probably would not have made it then in the current esports climate. But with where I was at then, so I went to the University of Missouri. I think I said the other day, the Harvard of the state of Missouri is Washington University in St. Louis, but we'll call Mizzou number 2 on that list. So I was there as a broadcast journalism major. They have just a great program, and that's why I wanted to go. Knowing I wanted to be a sports broadcaster, and everything was pretty much by the book for the first year and a half. And it was toward the end of my sophomore year. I remember that I had first started to get some of these random spells of coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, and what a lot of patients will tell you is a lot of the stuff just sort of happens out of the blue. And as I had alluded to, with really not having any health issues before, it definitely kind of surprised me. I was, you think, all right, I've never had asthma before. Why am I suddenly waking up in the middle of the night and feeling like I can't breathe and having all these coughing spells? And as well, being 19, not being the smartest or most mature person at the time, as I think most college-age people are, didn't really take it seriously. I remember my parents had initially given me like a really short burst of prednisone. They thought, I just had come down with something, and they did get me an inhaler just in case, just to have for the future. And I let that inhaler sit on my desk. The inhaler just collected dust more than anything, and I don't think I ever used it, even though I was having still a lot of these coughing spells. And so I remember going to the student health center at one point, which is I feel like it's a required odyssey for anybody in college. Go to your student health center and just sort of see what happens.
You have to go at least once.
Right. Now
you gotta get tested for STDs or find out you're pregnant there. I mean, it's a rite of passage.
You can't get your degree without it. I will say that, I mean, they have a very difficult job, obviously, but anybody who's had an experience there knows it's usually not, despite their best intentions, it's usually not the right answer or
it's not first-class medical treatment.
Correct. So I was given a pneumonia diagnosis at the time, which basically just led to taking a bunch of antibiotics that didn't really do anything. And I remember I spent the past maybe month of my sophomore year just in bed essentially, and didn't really do much. And I remember the first time that my parents had started to think, all right, maybe there's something more to this, and something is an issue here, was they came down. I was moving to a off-campus apartment for the summer to get in-state tuition, and because I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so I was paying out of state at the time and was going to significantly cut down my expenses. So was moving to an off-campus apartment. They had brought down my grandma's car. She was 90 at the time. She had stopped driving, and so they drove down a car. I drove them to St. Louis, and they were going to be flying home the next day. And in the hotel that night, had a really, really bad asthma attack that ended up really being, of course, in my mind, I was thinking, oh, this is no different than what's been happening the last couple months. And of course, they were alarmed to be kind of in the room with me just hacking my lungs out all night, basically. So at that point, they basically said, all right, hey, this inhaler thing is your friend, so use it. And started me on a little more prednisone, and they started reaching out to some of their, and I should say both of my parents are doctors and are both ER physicians who've practiced 25 plus years. So they have a lot of experience with this stuff. Of course, they are more
and a lot of experience with idiots ending up in their offices.
Yeah. But
So dealing with a 19-year-old not wanting to take their medicine was not their first rodeo.
Yeah, no, that was right up their alley, basically. And so they knew what to do as far as initial treatments, and I mean, they knew in an emergent situation like that how to get things under control, which is essentially just give a big burst of prednisone and have the patient use an inhaler liberally until everything works out. But I remember they started to ask around some of their colleagues who specialized in pulmonology, and I remember they had reached out to, there was a couple allergists that we set up appointments with to see if maybe I'd picked up some sort of fungal type thing, or if there was something I was allergic to. I was being exposed on a daily basis. And the thinking at the time was I was living in a fraternity house with about 100 other highly esteemed young gentlemen at the time, and the thought
who were super tidy and clean.
Right. And their thought was, in this pristine large house where we had to wear sandals to walk across the floors because of how sticky they were from certain liquid substances that accumulate from parties and whatnot.
Y'all had parties?
We dabbled. I'll say that. Every once in a while. But
you stopped playing FIFA long enough to have a party?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, every once in a while, I could tear myself away for a little bit. That was usually the strategy. But their thinking was, okay, this might be related. I remember at the end of, and this was, now we're into my junior year here, so this was first semester, and I was still having a lot of the breathing issues, despite taking. I was taking lots of bursts of prednisone, using my inhaler. That was pretty much it at that point. And junior year as well was when things started to ramp up on the broadcast front, because with a lot of programs and broadcasting it in a big program like the Mizzou journalism school is no different, where your first 2 years, it's sort of that whole weed out process. You're taking a lot of electives, a lot of classes that aren't very fun, more so to kind of whittle down just a huge base of kids that enter that program. So junior year was really when you start to get your first on-air opportunities, and you start to build your tape, your reel that you'll eventually be sending out, trying to get your first jobs in the industry. So I had gotten my first job, and as wanting to go into play-by-play, I was really lucky that there weren't many opportunities in that field. It was mostly like reporting and anchoring and that stuff at our local NBC affiliate TV station. But I got a job doing play-by-play for the Mizzou volleyball team. So I got the chance to travel with the team, call all their games. Mizzou is in the SEC, which is a pretty big money conference, meaning you get private charters to all the schools, so which is pretty fun. And you're kind of going all over the country doing this. So while I was having some of these developing asthma and breathing symptoms, I was traveling a ton. I went to China that year for a 3-week internship to broadcast a tennis tournament in Beijing, and needless to say, the air quality I don't think helped my breathing condition that much.
Yeah, so, I'm sure all those plane flights helped a lot too. All those good dry recycled air, just
right.
Germs.
The final row in the middle seat on a 13.5-hour United flight from O'Hare to Beijing. That was a lot of fun. So you kind of combine this. Yeah,
my body hurts just PTSD. Thinking about that.
I trust me, mine does too. And with and you think about all those experiences, which were great and really fun, but I could kind of feel my body it just felt like it was starting to wear down, and I had all these coughing issues. So you combine the travel and really starting to do a lot of stuff broadcasting wise with some of these ongoing symptoms. And I started having asthma attacks that were so bad that I needed to go to the ER. I remember the first one I had was Thanksgiving. We were spending it in Las Vegas with my grandma, ironically where I live now. But I remember having just this crazy stretch of broadcasts and travel. And I basically got to Vegas and essentially collapsed when I got to her house. I just felt my chest caving in and just couldn't breathe. And that was the first of about a half dozen ER visits I would make that year. during my junior year. And so we tried a lot of different things. I remember getting a nebulizer machine, which probably saved me from another dozen trips to the ER with asthma attacks, just because it was, an ER grade nebulizer machine that I could have at home. I moved out of the fraternity house I was living in at the end of that first semester. So we're now into the spring semester of my junior year. And so this was early 2014, which was the year I ended up getting diagnosed. And essentially, once all those symptoms and once the cat was out of the bag, and there was really nothing that could help. And so I remember just kind of barely making it to the end of my junior year. I was one of those things. I was just trying to get to the finish line and make it in one piece back home. And so I was home for the summer, really wasn't doing anything. This was the summer before my senior year. And that's when, really in the final month before my eventual diagnosis, so about June of 2014, I started to get kind of the traditional and sort of hallmark final symptoms of vasculitis leading up to a diagnosis. And so it was a lot of rashes, like all over my hands, arms, legs, to the point where the rashes on my hands were so painful I couldn't even like hold a glass in my hand. It just hurt that bad. And I would basically then also wake up with these really bad stomach aches. It was almost like the worst stomach ache you ever had from the time you wake up until the time you go to bed. And so I wasn't really eating, wasn't sleeping very well, was still not really breathing well at all, and not really doing anything. And for whatever reason, I guess we'll remind everybody that I was 19, and we'll just give that as a wide brow excuse for all these dumb decisions I was making. But I remember still trying to play tennis that summer. That was the main sport I played growing up and in high school. And so I remember playing in this like amateur summer league, kind of for either small college players or for former high school players. And so a lot of my friends, former teammates, played. And there was this night in early July I remember playing, and it was at the point where I was starting to get some numbness in my feet. So, and just all sorts of swelling and inflammation. I really couldn't breathe well, could barely grip a racket because my hands were in so much pain from this rash, and I couldn't really feel my feet. So those are not three things you want to have happen when you're trying to play a tennis match, let alone do anything else. And it's the only time that I remember actively just trying to tank and lose a match and just get out of there.
Andre Agassi style, just taking matches.
Yeah. You know what? Sometimes you do what you got to do, and it was. I still remember that was such like it was almost like being in a dream, that whole experience, because I was playing doubles, and so my doubles partner was not aware of what was going on. I didn't really know him that well, so I couldn't just say like, "Hey man, I'm really sick. I got to get out of here." So it was almost like being in this bubble where the three other people on the court were all trying, and I was trying to make it look like I was without really trying. And in the end, I remember losing the match. Was the happiest I've ever been to lose a match. Raced to my car, drove home, and I got home, and my parents knew that. I mean, just the way I looked, they could tell this was worse than normal. And my mom we had, in addition to having the nebulizer treatment machine, we also had a pulse ox meter, essentially just one that you put on your finger to get your oxygen level. And I think I was at about 83 or 84 on the reading, which is pretty low, to say the least. And it was at that point that we went to the ER, and within a few days after that, and again, I was really fortunate going through a lot of this, because with both of my parents being doctors, they kind of knew how to set up the process. I remember my mom had called ahead to her ER, so there was a bed waiting for me. They could stabilize me, and then we set up all the tests. So I kind of had I had the whole works. I had the bronchoscopy done, which is, anybody who has experienced that knows the joys of that process, and biopsies, all sorts of fun stuff. And eventually got my diagnosis in July of 2014. So it's been almost 6 years we're coming up on. I'm almost halfway to you, Brandon. I know you just had your 12th anniversary, but that was really the start of my story. I mean, getting to that point, and it's crazy to think about how many developments there have been as a whole, as far as research goes, and also as far as growth within the VF. I didn't get involved with the VF until early 2017, and then like you were saying, met you just a few months later at that symposium in Chicago. But it's crazy how much that changed things. And being at 20 years old and being back in college or about to go back to college for your senior year, it didn't change. Some things didn't change at the start, but I realized a lot of things had to change just as a result of kind of running into a brick wall with a lot of the drugs I was on. I started on Cytoxan, which I think was your first drug as well, Brandon. So it was kind of the way things began, along with I think I was on 80 milligrams of prednisone at the start, and kind of had to deal with that. So that was sort of the beginning of the journey, and it took probably two and a half solid years until I really started to feel like myself again after that.
Yeah, the journey to diagnosis, it looks so different for all of us, and it's honestly a lot of times, the worst you feel because you're going through so many ups and downs, or you probably like I was during my 7-month process of getting diagnosed. They were like not knowing what was going on, but like with you, they kept prescribing you prednisone, which is part of the treatment plan. It's like, it probably, I don't know, depending on the patient, probably is roughly about a quarter or a third of the important part of the treatment. And so they're giving you part of the treatment. So you're kind of getting a little bit of help and feeling a little bit better, but then ultimately they're always, of course, trying to get you off of prednisone and get you off the corticosteroids, because they, the side effects of them are often as bad or worse than the symptoms that they might be trying to fix. So it's, it's a messy world. And I know that like I would have kind of like up and down periods when I was on that path to diagnosis. And then I got diagnosed, and then things immediately even got worse. But it's just kind of the start of that journey, because you finally have you have a name to what's been going on, because you kind of, especially when you're young like that, and you're used to just kind of like plowing through life. You might have, I think probably the worst thing that had happened to me before, physically, that had happened to me before I got diagnosed was, I had like a stress reaction in my shin one time. I fractured my skull. That's really the only bone I've ever broken. I ran into a guide wire, like literally ran, of course, because I was running.
That seems like a crucial bone to potentially.
Yeah. But yeah, so like, it's stuff like that really, when you're 19 or 20, it's like, that's the worst pain or the worst physical thing that you've been through. And, you're used to, as an athlete, just kind of plowing through things and, thinking things are going to get better. You're young, your body bounces back, but then you just, you've got that head down mentality to grind, because like you were on a path with your, schooling and like what you were majoring in the career you were trying to ultimately get into, which is, being a sports broadcaster, doing play-by-play. And so you're just, you've got that linear focus. Like I had a linear focus as an athlete, and you're just like, well, I've just got to plow through this. It'll get better, but then it doesn't. And it's just, it's really weird. Like having cause in the back of your mind, I don't know, did you think something major was going on? Cause like, I kind of had like this thought that like, there's gotta be something else going on, but it wasn't something like I was like hell bent on, like, there's something wrong with me. Like, y'all got to figure it out. It was just kind of like, there's gotta be something else going on here. Like, this can't just be me like having a bad sinus infection.
Right. To be honest, and I think part of it is just the fact that I was fortunate enough to have doctors for parents, and any issue I ever had was just immediately solved by them, basically, growing up. And so I there was certainly a little bit of concern, just because, I mean, I'd been sick before, but nothing to that degree and that extent as far as how long things had lasted. But to be honest, when I finally got the diagnosis, I remember my first thought was actually of relief, because my assumption was that, okay, we found the solution. It took a little bit longer than normally it would have, just based on any past history. And okay, this thing is over. We've got the right drugs, and we'll be good. We'll be back to normal here in no time, and we'll go back to college for our senior year, and it'll be just like nothing ever happened. And I think there's a couple factors to that. One, you have a disease that you've never heard of, so it's not like it's not like they tell you have cancer and you obviously like know what that means. They say you have, at the time it was still called Churg-Strauss syndrome. It hadn't, and that it just speaks to how little was known, has been known about the disease, and how, and we're now calling it EGPA, and
yeah, the super catchy EGPA now.
Yes, the eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, which just rolls off the tongue for everybody. But I think that combination with also the fact that the drugs I were given, and this also just speaks to my lack of knowledge, and a big reason why I did not follow my parents' footsteps into the medical profession. But when they told me Cytoxan would be
the apple fell really far from the tree, is what you're saying.
Correct. That's exactly what I'm saying. So the giving, being told I'd be starting on Cytoxan, and I was pretty out of it at that point. I don't really remember if there were like these concerned looks, or if there was an explanation of what this drug would do. But I had always assumed that when people referred to chemo, they were referring to a singular drug called chemo. I thought that's what it was. And so I remember this drug, and I just remember thinking, all right, sure, yeah, I'll take it. Not really putting two and two together, that this was the start of a treatment of a chemotherapy, essentially, and that I was going to have maybe not the traditional, like what you read about or see on TV or in the movies type of chemo with your hair falling out, but that at the same time, this drug was going to make me feel really, really bad. The prednisone was going to do some really, really bad things as well. And it would take a long time to try and figure out the next step. And you kind of alluded to, you take these versaprednisone leading up to it, and that's part of the treatment plan. And I think for my parents, it's kind of what started, their interest in trying to learn more about vasculitis. It's what eventually led to my interest in getting involved and trying to share my story and give back to the community, because as ER physicians, I mean, they share this frustration with so many other people, where they had maybe read about this disease once in a textbook at Loyola Medical School, where they both went in like 1985. So it's something that they really had no experience dealing with. And they also knew that the side effects of prednisone long-term were really, really bad. So they didn't really want me on prednisone, but they also were told that and started to see that it was a necessity. So it kind of began this tug of war that it was, like me and my parents were having against my own body, because we all knew, we knew the literature on this, that you just couldn't be on prednisone long term, and we kept trying to come off of it, kept trying to get me to wean down, and it was like my body would just rebel every time, and all the symptoms would come back. And so I think back to that, and I just remember feeling so bad for my parents, and especially for my mom. It was almost like her researching this and looking into all this stuff, and dealing with our insurance company at the time. When you start dealing with these really, really big time drugs you're having to take, it was almost like a second job for her, in addition to still being a full-time practicing ER doctor along with my dad. And so I just felt this sense of, I mean, they certainly felt frustrated that they didn't know about it, and they started trying to reach out to people, try to figure things out on their own. And that experience, I don't think, differs from a lot of people who, you don't have to have ER doctors as parents to be frustrated with that process when you get diagnosed, and there's a lot that you don't know, and a lot that you're not sure of what to expect is how you're going to feel when you begin that journey. And so from that point on, from July 2014 until basically a full 2 years later, I mean, it was a pretty rough stretch, and I just remember feeling kind of cheated out of my senior year of college, because I still tried to do a lot of the same things that most people my age were doing, which was not very smart. And it's at least, if there's a silver lining, it's those experiences I can sort of talk to people about today is, all right, here's what not to do. Like when the VF will sort of pair me with a newly diagnosed patient, I can kind of tell them, all right, do this, this, and this, don't do this, this, and this, because I did all of those things, and I know how that impacts your body. And so it was that sort of 2-year stretch that was really, really frustrating. And I think that's what a lot of us go through. And there are those feelings of not being able to recognize yourself because of the the moon face, what prednisone does to you, and then also just not really feeling like yourself either because of a lot of those same impacts. And I guess the timing for me, and I guess it's maybe why people have found my story a little bit interesting over the years, is just that it was juxtaposed with trying to graduate college, kind of being in the middle of this, trying to start a full-time job, which I, by some miracle, got a full-time broadcasting job out of college at this small radio station just north of Columbia, Missouri, where I went to school. At a Crest Radio in Moberly, Missouri, where I was working 50, 60 hours a week and didn't really, I didn't tell my boss I had this, I was dealing with this. So a lot of different factors were going on, but I always just think back to my parents and some of their own frustrations because it was the first time I'd ever seen them not really have an answer when it came to something in the medical field. And I still think about that whenever we do, because I do now the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast that I co-host with Kaylee Bynes, and that's more geared toward medical professionals. And so it's one of those things that just sort of sticks in the back of my head because I know how much they obviously care for me and how it hurt them at the time and how they're still trying to learn more and trying to tell their fellow colleagues in the field to keep a lot of those considerations in mind whenever they see a patient who maybe comes in and is really sick and might exhibit a few traits that you could then tie on to vasculitis.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I don't remember where exactly I was at in my journey as a patient, but when you start making the regular ER trips for things that are going on with your health, you kind of become a 3-ring circus there with what's going on because like the ER doc finally gets in and it's like, it's like, oh man, I hadn't seen this since med school. Like, let me call everybody else in the hospital over here. Like, and it's just good. It's like, it's like the dog and pony show. They just like want to bring everybody in and be like, look at this guy. And they're like, oh man. And they want to ask you a million questions. Or there's the docs that kind of like brush it off and don't act like it's really a big deal or don't really want to take into consideration that might be going on. I remember there was an instance a couple of years ago where I was exhibiting some heart attack symptoms about a week or two after a Rituxan infusion, which they didn't know at the time is something that some patients get. And the doctor basically just came in and was like, oh, well, I mean, if your heart's feeling funny, it's probably because the vasculitis is in your heart, and then just kind of like walked out of the room. And I was like, he's like, it's not a big deal. Like, you'll be fine. Well, we're going to get you out of here. And I'm like, that is kind of a big deal. If the vasculitis is in my heart, like, that's not something you just brush off and walk out of the room and send me home. Like, I think you need to call my doctor if you think that's where it's at. But like, that was just basically his like, oh, well, if it's in your heart, I mean, vasculitis can be in your heart. So like, I mean, you're probably going to be fine. Like, and it's like, no, that's like the last stage with mine. And if it gets there, it gets really, really tricky. So like, let's not just brush that off as like, oh, well, it's like, you don't need a pinky. Like, we'll just lop it off and move on. So I've seen the complete, gamut of doctors, like the complete spectrum of doctors of like curiosity or like, oh man, I hadn't seen this. And then at some point in time, you also realize that like some of them don't remember much about it or haven't. And they're literally just like Googling it. Like, I guess in my brain, I'd always thought that like, which was just stupid, but I just never given it a thought. Like, I just assumed that there was like a medical textbook in their office that they would go back to and refer to that was like the definitive thing. And it's like, no, they just like pull up Google just like you do. They go to the Mayo Clinic website or, WebMD and just like read off like, oh, so this is what they're doing for that now. Like, I didn't know that they had a treatment for that. Like, and, he was like, I was reading on the Mayo Clinic's website. Like, the guy just like admitted to me one time, he was like reading on the Mayo Clinic website before he came into my room. And I was like, I thought y'all had like some sort of registry or something that was a little more definitive than what I do. Like, so it's wild, those experiences that you start to have with doctors. And I'm certainly grateful for what, you and Kaylee are doing with y'all's podcasts, and, getting different people on, from the medical profession. And, cause that's one of the VF's big missions, is to, like, is continuing education programs for doctors. And, cause there's a wide, even amongst vasculitis, or doctors or rheumatologists that will treat vasculitis, like, there's varying degrees of knowledge and where they're at in their own, understandings of the disease. Like, if they're up to date on stuff, like, it's in, depending on how close you are to a doctor or a center that or a hospital that has a vasculitis center, like, you can get a variety of treatments, and then you end up with doctors that are, arguing with each other. You can have your rheumatologist not agreeing with your ENT, or your pulmonologist, or your kidney doctor, your nephrologist, like, and people can, and the patient can kind of just get stuck in the middle. So, with the speed that information can be shared now, like, doctors don't have to wait for like a once a year conference to go learn all this stuff. They can learn them, anytime they have extra time. And I know doctors are all obviously incredibly busy, and it's not like after an 8 or 10 hour day, like, the last thing they want to do is go home and read up on medical research. But, the more that we can get materials out there, and the more information we can get out there, and just having conversations with people and having conversations with doctors, and can, expand people's knowledge. So, and ultimately affect the patient's lives, because that's ultimately what the end goal is increasing the quality of life of our patients, because our fellow patients, is because, like, so many of us do suffer in silence and stuff. And, for us, both of us, it was, I think that there is a common thread in our journeys. It's like spending your senior year of college on Cytoxan and making a bunch of dumb decisions, still trying to go out, still trying to have fun. And you're kind of a shell of your former self, but you're, like, trying really hard to kind of put on face. And I wasn't living with like 100 other dudes, but I was living with like 5 other guys that were on the cross country and track teams with me at the time. But I decided to do the victory lap thing and go for an extra 2 years of college, just mainly so I could keep running. But it was, I used the excuse of getting a graduate degree, but it was mainly to get those last 2 years of college that had been taken away from me, get them back, Well,
I really wanted, I think everybody wants to do deep down the victory lap. It's just a matter of, and whether you actually, you can actually, well, basically whether your parents say it's okay, at least in my case. And I do think, looking back on it, it was probably the best thing for me, just because getting out of school, getting out of that environment, and being forced into kind of this regiment of, even though it was really high intensity, working a ton of hours, making very little to compensate for those hours, but still having an actual job in a profession that is just so hard to break into. And also knowing that, my broadcast tape was just so bad and not even close to where I wanted it to be. And a lot of the reason was because you think about how hard it is, like, trying to broadcast when you can't breathe. And I know you this from, like, trying to run when you can't really breathe. It's kind of the same concept. And
I think I read in a textbook somewhere that breathing is important to, like, exercise and talking.
Yeah, I saw it on the Mayo Clinic website. Yeah,
I saw it. Yeah, I saw it on Google somewhere.
Yeah,
it was in one of those textbooks I was supposed to read.
That seems like a pretty realistic conclusion that esteemed person came to. But with trying to broadcast, and so many of those experiences in college, why I said it was sort of a miracle that I got a first job, was because my tape really was a collection. You want your tape to be always a reflection of your best work, and I just never felt like I could get there, because I was feeling, like you said, a shell of myself. And that's pretty much the best way to describe it when you're going through a lot of that. And there had been times, even before diagnosis, where I'd had some sort of scary close calls, where so often, and this is still the case for me, even with, you deal with some minor stuff on the side, even though I'm pretty well, my vasculitis is really well under control now. But if you're ever sick or dealing with anything, usually somewhat similar to, how you have adrenaline take over as an athlete when you're about to start a competition or something like that. Sort of the same thing applies when you're broadcasting, where you get that adrenaline rush, right? You got the headset on, you're about to go on the air, and you just sort of block everything out, and it allows you to sort of push through, and you forget about everything you're feeling until after the broadcast. And that's usually how I've always been, and I've always, been able to get locked in pretty well. But, even when there were even some times when I was sick to the point where it kind of crossed through that barrier and made me think about it on air, which was a really frightening thought, because the last thing you want to be thinking of is what happens if I just can't breathe anymore while I'm doing this game? Like, what am I going to do? And there was one close call I remember having when we were in Gainesville, Florida. It was a Mizzou, Florida match my junior year, so my first year with this play-by-play job, where we're in this packed arena. There's about 5,500 fans at the O-Dome. It's the same arena where they play Florida basketball games in. So you've probably seen games of theirs on TV. It's just a raucous environment. The way they set up the stands is such that the fans are basically right on top of the court. And so, so here I am courtside in the broadcast row, essentially, and was basically having an active asthma attack on the air, and was basically just like pressing my diaphragm out to it was almost like you're just clenching as tightly as you can to prevent your chest from caving in. Now, of course, trying to project and actually talk while you're doing that is very difficult, especially when it's a radio broadcast. And so it's not like you're on TV and you can just let the picture speak for themselves. You kind of have to tell people what's going on, because they're relying on you for it. And that was the only time I ever really remember feeling like panicked in the middle of one of those, because I just remember feeling so close to just sort of losing it, as far as starting to cough and really needing some sort of nebulizer treatments, or needing to go to a hospital. And so by some, I don't know how, but some way, somehow I was able to kind of hold it together. And part of that was they don't do it anymore, but they used to have an intermission period, like a 10-minute halftime after the second set of these best of 5 volleyball matches. And so I at least allowed myself to recollect a little bit. We had a several minute break, and I remember throwing up in the like the courtside bathroom, just because there was so much stress, on my lungs, just this back and forth tug of war. And fortunately, that kind of reset me. I remember the match was over. It was a sweep in 3 sets, so we were able to get out of there pretty quickly. Sometimes if it goes 5 sets, you can have a 2.5 hour match. So I was very fortunate in that regard. But I thought about a lot of those things then, as finally starting a career, and at least being grateful that I wasn't in that position. But at the same time, I still didn't really feel all that good. Still trying to work 50, 60 hours a week, being at the station, broadcasting games, and then getting home at midnight and, repeating it, being back at the radio station at 9 a.m. and doing it 6 days a week, just as that kind of eternal grind. And so you think about that juxtaposed with like my parents, and you kind of alluded to how everybody, and something I think not a lot of people really understand about from our side as patients, is that it's not just like one doctor you have to have a whole team. And for me, it was tough, because my team, the quarterback, so to speak, were my parents, but they were based 8 hours away in Wisconsin. And my mom always gave me a really hard time, and still does for that matter, about how I was just so stoic and never really did a good job of expressing how I actually was feeling. I would always just sort of say like, I'm fine. Don't worry about it. I'm okay. And so it was really hard for them to actually have a good sense of how I was feeling from that distance. So, it was like, on the one hand, I felt really fortunate that I wasn't completely on the verge of collapsing on the air, and I was still at least able to be now called a professional, and I was able to broadcast games for a living. But on the other hand, I still knew that there was just so much work to be done. And we went from Cytoxan to Imuran to Cellcept, and could never get below the 10 milligrams of prednisone. And it wasn't until early 2016 that we had any sort of a breakthrough. So it just kind of gives you an idea of how long that process actually takes. It's as you were saying earlier, Brandon, it's not the reality is not you get a diagnosis, you take a couple pills, and you feel back to yourself. It's just not how it works.
Yeah, it's a long path, and I know my parents were, I mean, because when you do get diagnosed when you're like 18, 19, 20, like it is kind of a weird thing, because you are still like, you're still, most of us are still on their parents' health insurance, which is you know a huge relief. Because when you have to start paying for that on your own, it's a giant burden, we must say, and we'll
I
save
just,
that conversation right now for another podcast. But
yeah, I just celebrated the big 26-year birthday
yeah,
so I know the feeling. Yeah.
yeah. So, um, we'll save that topic for. I think we need to have all of us on one of these one time just to talk about the joys of the the medical system and dealing with billing, and our thoughts about how that could be improved, and how stuff could be improved in this country, especially when you talk to patients in other countries and how seamless their care seems to be. But yeah, it's like when you've got your parents involved. Like my parents were always like, I don't want to say like overly involved. Like they weren't helicopter parents by any stretch of the imagination, but like my dad was my high school coach and he worked at my school. Like your parents are doctors and they were your doctor for a very long time. And so they're involved with your stuff, and like you are kind of, because like as you turn 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, like you're a young adult, and you're your own person, but like your parents are still really involved in everything. And my parents have been finding out, they obviously knew a lot of stuff was going on that I wouldn't talk about because I was kind of the same way. Like, I mean, they saw some rough things. And there was a couple times like my dad had to like carry me from one room to the other. And you know, I also also went to the sperm bank with my mom at one point. That was a super enlightening experience, when your mom walks into the waiting room with you at the sperm bank, and drops you off like she's been dropping you off at school your entire life. It's like, go have fun. We'll see you later. See you in a bit. So there, I promise this is going somewhere. It is weird. Have you had any like conversations with your parents in recent years where they've found things out that you were going through, or like, do they get upset, or like, why is other people finding out about this, or you've talked to other people about this, but you didn't tell us?
Yeah, I mean, we always were pretty. I was always really open with them about stuff. Like when it came, push came to shove, right? And I sort of had to say what I was actually feeling as far as when the disease was ongoing. But I remember there've been a couple moments when I've written stuff and eventually having done stuff for the VF and having spoken in a couple of avenues about my journey and what was real what I was really feeling, especially in the build up to that. And I remember my mom seeing some of those and being like, well, I would have only freaked out more had I known about that then, but we're glad that you're okay now at least. And it's certainly something that it kind of goes back to me just being really, I think just by nature, really stoic about it. And it also reflects too on how, and like when you're diagnosed, you don't really know what to do really as far as like how to tell people about it, because nobody, it's not something that you've ever really thought about, and it's not something that anybody tells you how to do. And so I always just tried to be a minimalist with it. And so and part of that is just from like knowing my parents really well and knowing that my mom, as the really true quarterback of the medical team, for me, and I mean for other people obviously as an ER doctor, but I knew she would really worry if there were a lot of stuff, if I told her a lot of stuff that she didn't have a direct answer for. And so that's partly like why I think about the podcast I'm doing with Kaylee, and I'm lucky that Kaylee she's a master's of public health and knows so much, and so she's, I think, a lot more qualified than I am to ask a lot of these doctors questions. But I can at least bring some of that perspective of knowing the frustrations there from both sides, from both the patient and the physician side of it, and where you're trying to get to, especially once you are diagnosed, and even when you're in a quote unquote type of remission, it's a chemical remission and you don't really feel well, and you realize that, again, similar to how you don't really know how chemotherapy really works until you're actually on it. You also don't really know how the whole remission process really works in our case until you go through it. You realize that it's just not a straight line. But I think too about that whole sense of just, I think it's more of how your personality is, how you deal with that. And I've always been a very laid back, like all my friends know me, as just kind of easygoing, positive, upbeat guy. And so it was really, I wouldn't say super hard, or, it wasn't like frustrating, but I just didn't really know the right way to go about telling people, hey, like, I've just been diagnosed with this super rare autoimmune disease. I don't even really know much about it, so I can't really tell you that much, but that's what I know. And I think I kind of just ended up settling on, because it's one of those things, I didn't want to make people, you don't want to give somebody bad news. You don't want to make people think, oh no, what's going to happen, and you don't have any answers to that. So I remember just telling a few of my really close friends in college that I would spend a lot of time with, and my main thinking for that was just so that if we were ever still out together, back at college, still hanging out, and it would essentially clear me of any potential peer pressure related things. If it would just be something they would have in the back of their mind, like, oh, we're not going to make we're not going to go for another round of shots because we know that Ben has this deal. And I could kind of get out of some of those instances, which that was maybe one of the only smart things I actually did, Brandon, because they at least knew, and my friends are all good guys, so they at least knew not to push the envelope, especially once I was sick and came back to school and was trying to navigate all of those things.
Yeah, so they weren't complete douchebags. They backed off on the shit talking just a little bit.
They razzed me a lot, but they at least knew when it was. They knew I wouldn't be telling them if it wasn't like an actual nice thing. And I remember they would use it at times. They would try to introduce me to girls that way. They'd be like, hey, you got to meet Ben. He's got this like insane disease that he somehow lived through. And I'd just be rolling my eyes like, you got to be kidding. What are you doing right now?
That's a great pickup line, I'm sure.
I know.
Yeah, this guy's got a lot of baggage. You want to go with him?
Hey, you should see how many of these prednisone pills he's popping per day. Yeah.
Yeah. You want a little white pill? You want me to drop it in your drink? It's a little pick me up.
Yeah, it's gonna make your face look like you just had your wisdom teeth out. But I mean, hey, it'll feel great.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot harder taking good angled Instagram pictures with a moon face when it looks round from every angle.
Yeah, I'm not a big social media guy to begin with, but needless to say, if you go on the internet, there will not be any. There's really no evidence of my existence from really pre 2016, essentially. Maybe a little bit at the end of 2015, but yeah, and that's part of it. And especially once I started working with the VF, and I ended up getting introduced to them late 2016, early 2017, and I know you felt the same way, Brandon. Once you meet people who go through that, and like, it's one thing for us, I feel like, from a self-image standpoint as guys, you can deal with it. It sucks, but it's not the end of the world. You know that eventually it's going to be better. You're going to be able to recognize yourself in the mirror at some point. But I just remember feeling so gutted just meeting some of the teenage girls or some of the college age girls that we've met who've had a lot of gone through the same things we have, and just, how brutal that has to be. And it's just one of the many ways in which, or one of the many, I guess, inspirations that like I've had in trying to share my story and just help as far as getting the word out, help get more awareness from the self-advocacy standpoint, and then B, the research side of things, so that you think about people going through that experience. And yeah, I can't even imagine if I was like in a sorority or something, and not to like totally go pit the experience of making it totally different based on gender, but still, like, it is a lot worse if you go through it as a girl, and you think about and like you talked with Kate about this, the whole on your podcast, like the whole like concept of not knowing if you're going to be able to have kids, and just being told that very bluntly by doctors as soon as you get diagnosed. That's something that it's impossible for me or you to put ourselves in those shoes, but it's at least kind of added a little bit more fuel to that fire of trying to do our part and help raise awareness for everything.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's, some people in 2020 would say it's a little touchy to talk about those things, but it certainly is easier for us as a males. I mean, honestly, it's in both of our professions, image and weight are a thing. They're a topic. Like, if you're going to be on TV, like, you're required to look nice, right? Like, you could not show up in my regular day wardrobe to, be a play-by-play announcer on ESPN or ABC or, Fox Sports or whatever it is. It's like, you've got to look nice. You got to look sharp. And, the image is unfortunately very important for those jobs. And, there is stress there for that. And, in the running world and most endurance sports, like, weight is an issue. Like, we were joking about before the podcast started about, like, running and you're pounding the ground, and, extra weight that you got to carry around is energy that you're spending. So it's, it's certainly part of the equation. And when you've been on lows of prednisone and putting on 20 pounds in a week or 15 pounds in a week, it's, not that you're going to be running fast anytime soon anyways, but it's a variable that, like, you've been used to being really fit your whole life. And then all of a sudden you don't feel good and you don't look good. And, I managed to navigate those waters pretty well myself, but, like, this thing's just always in the back of your head, and that we all struggle with, from one side or the other. But certainly I think, unfortunately, because of our society, a lot of people put a lot of pressure on, especially young female girls. And a lot of it's, self-imposed, or they feel like they have to look a certain way or wear certain things. So it's seeing them and talking to them about it is heartbreaking. For sure.
I know. So I know we both wish it wasn't that way, but yeah, I mean, it's part of the reality of it. And it's part of why, like, I feel so fortunate to have been just introduced to the VF. And it's crazy how, like, I remember finding out that the VF was based in Kansas City, which is only about an hour and a half west of where I was living at the time in Columbia, and just having no idea about this organization that existed. And then, you think about, like, that whole introduction process. And it was actually, my mom had actually donated to the VF in my name. I remember it was Christmas 2016. And I just remember just how touching a gift that was, and what a great gesture I felt like that was from my mom, because I knew how much she had been through herself, going through that, that whole stretch. And, like, at the time, my grandma was really old. She was into her mid 90s, and she was in an assisted living facility. So my mom it was almost like she was working 3 jobs, basically, taking care of my grandma every day, trying to work her own ER shifts, which are obviously, you talk about extreme high intensity and everything. And then, dealing with my own disease and everything. So, getting that introduction to the VF, and, how fortunate I felt to get involved with Joyce Coleman and some of the other leaders there. But then to fast forward to June of 2017, and then to actually meet so many of those people. And, obviously I think we've talked before, and I know Allison and Kate have made fun of us. There aren't as many guys in that group. It's just, I think, part of how the disease skews, between males and females. But there's only a few of us, and I remember sitting in that room and just hearing all these people's stories, and individuals who I think a lot of them we consider friends of ours, and, at least at the very least, fellow vasculitis warriors, I guess you could say, fellow patients.
Yeah.
That we met at that first symposium we were all at in 2017, and just how impactful that was, because I think we were both in the same boat. We didn't really know what to expect with that, how many people would be there, whether it would be us talking to a bunch of a room full of old people. We just had no idea. And I remember coming out of that weekend just feeling so inspired and so touched by a lot of those people, and it helped me. It really gave me a drive to do more, and try and challenge myself to see, all right, what more can I do? Because there's definitely a little sense of that guilt, just knowing that, I had, like, the perfect avenue of parents as doctors, access to, the best care. And it was obvious from going to that and meeting a lot of people that, and yours is a good example as well. It's not the same for everybody. And so I just, without that, without being able to see that side of it and get introduced. I mean, I'm not sure how I would think about it now, but it gave me such a different perspective and outlook on it, and it's a big reason why, yeah, we're here talking right now.
Yeah, it's been inspiring, seeing what so many of the people that we've been around over the last, I guess, 3 years since that symposium, what everybody's doing, the outreach that everybody's able to, do as patients, and, bring people into the fold and the flock, and help take care of our little community, because it's, certainly not going to be a community that's ever large, and you don't want it really to be large, because that means a large number of people are suffering. But you can certainly help a lot of people by sharing your story, and continuing to chase your dreams. I think that's what's been so inspiring about knowing people like you and Allison, who have lived very sort of like freelance kind of lifestyles. It's very similar to my semi-pro running lifestyle of like, this is my dream. I'm going to chase after it. This is what I want to do. It's not going to be easy. I'm going to have this other thing that I'm going to have to potentially, deal with at times that could get really bad during it. But like, I would rather keep trying to do what I want to do and live that life than just like completely give up, because those are really your two options. It's like, give up on everything that you've wanted to do since you were like 10, 12, 13 years old, probably when you first started dreaming about being a sportscaster. So it's either give up or keep moving forward. And, I've been, it's so weird using the words like blessed or lucky with some of the friends and people that I've been able to meet through this disease and be inspired by over the last, 3 or 4 years. And, it's such a weird, like almost oxymoron thing to say. 'Cause like, even in my own treatments at times, like I've felt lucky to have access to certain doctors, or get lucky that it only took 6 or 7 months for me to get diagnosed, and it wasn't 15 months like you. And, you're like, well, I was lucky to have parents as doctors. And, some people are like, well, I was lucky enough to have, the NIH or the Mayo Clinic in my backyard. But because like, there are other people that have it far worse than us. And it's always so weird, even when you look at other patients and their symptoms and what they go through with the exact same disease, and it might be rougher than yours, or it might not be as bad as yours. And you like, when all of a sudden something that's really, really bad is not as bad as it possibly could be, somehow you feel lucky. And it's kind of it'll kind of mess you up a little bit in the mind if you think about it too hard.
Oh, but to your point about, I think about my own decision to start doing all freelance work, and how, at the time I just felt like it was something I had to do if I wanted to get my career to the point where I wanted it to go to. And, I'm really fortunate now that I've been able to do games for some solid brand regional networks that you would recognize, like Fox Sports Midwest, for instance. I think you mentioned them earlier, and places like that, and now being based in a big market like Las Vegas. But you think back in so many of those things, without some of the developments that we've seen in the vasculitis world as far as research and new treatments, and without a lot of those things, you think about it, and I'm not so sure that I really would have felt confident in my ability just to go out on a limb like that, even though, and I think you said earlier, we could do a whole other podcast on like health insurance stuff in the country. And we could also do another one that would be basically solely led by me on the intricacies of the play-by-play industry in America, how crazy and complicated it is. There's really no one right path or one way to go about it. And there's just so many different factors. And so for me, I think at first, I certainly know that if I had continued the same initial path as I had been in a super small market, doing these high school games, small college games, you're kind of at the lowest rung of the ladder, which is really good when you start out. And it's something that you need to get the reps when you're learning how to be a professional. But I knew that, once I felt like I had gotten the fundamentals down, once I felt like I had a really solid tape and a good foundation, I just knew that being in that same type of situation, I just wasn't going to be happy long term. And I also knew that I would need to feel more confident about my own health and my ability to kind of branch out and be willing to travel a bunch again and be willing to take any assignment anywhere, any part of the country, be able to say yes, because that's such a big element of our industry and being able to, build your brand, build your own career, to build up trust with these different networks, different people within the industry. So it really wasn't until, at least in my case, basically by 2017, that process really had taken a turn in 2016 when I ended up getting introduced to the doctor that would introduce me to Nucala, basically, which really changed everything in my own case. But Dr. Wexler, who is seen by most people as basically the authority on EGPA globally.
The guy.
Yeah, he's meant a ton, and he's at the National Jewish Health Center in Denver. So that's where I started to go. I remember seeing him in 2016 and was eventually approved for Nucala. And this was the infancy. Nucala had just been approved that year by the FDA, and was able to start on that late in 2016. And basically by 2017, I remember by the time I went to that symposium in Chicago of June, I was essentially off of prednisone. I think I was maybe at 1 or 2 milligrams a day at that point, but I was, for all intents,
that's nothing.
Off.
That's nothing.
Yeah, not only that's nothing compared to the 80 I initially was on. But yeah, by that point, and I felt basically back to normal. I felt as healthy as I had been since basically high school, essentially, or freshman year maybe of college. And so it wasn't really until that point that I felt that inner confidence to be able to really not think about it. And I think we still all think about it a little bit to some degree every day. And even now we do, just with how it does affect your body and how there's residual effects still that I deal with, and I'm sure you deal with too today. But if it wasn't for that that development, and you think about how new a development like Nucala is, I'm not sure I would have been able to take that path. And it's something you certainly think about all the you think about all the what ifs you have both in your personal past, your professional past, and that's certainly something that impacted both in a really big way. And so yeah, I think it ties into what you were saying, just feeling lucky in a way. And it's I certainly feel lucky that drug happened to be introduced for my specific, extremely rare disease, even within the branch of VF diseases. EGPA is one of the rarer ones. And the fact that it happened when it did, when I was a position where I needed something to kind of give me a reason to stay optimistic and positive, because after dealing with some sort of symptoms for, at that point, it had been 3-4 years, you start to get to the end of the line as far as being able to wake up and stay positive every day. It wears on you so much. So I think about that a lot, especially when I'm now in a big market in Vegas, being on the West Coast, where I'm a lot happier and in a much better place, both personally and professionally at this point.
Yeah, I mean, Rituxan was kind of that for me. I mean, I've had it on and off. I got my first dose of it, I believe, in 2013. But it has, like, if I had to have Cytoxan every single time that I've had a relapse or, had issues, that required me to get some Rituxan at the time, like, my career would look very different, and as if my career would look very different as well if I'd never had vasculitis. And that's honestly, like, one of the, not to rag on the media, but like there's 2 questions that, like, I've gotten asked from time to time that kind of drive me a little bit nuts. And one of them is like, like, how long do you go, like, where you don't, think about this disease? You go, is it a couple of days? Is it a couple of weeks? Is it a month? And I'm like, a few hours. Like, I don't think more than a few hours since I was diagnosed. If there's been a few hours that I was awake and I wasn't thinking about it, it was, I would be shocked. I would, because especially with our work now, because, we both talk to patients on a very regular basis, or talk to parents of patients, and or talk to y'all who are our friends. So, like, you're dealing with it on a professional level, daily. But, like, that one's just always kind of been one that's just like, do you obviously don't understand the thought process of having something super rare. And the other one is like, well, how fast do you think you could have run if you hadn't gotten, this crazy rare disease? And it's like, I don't know. Like, what am I supposed to say to that? Like, it's just like, I think I've attributed them to just people not doing their homework. But, there's those what ifs, and it's like you can't, and you learn if you have a healthy relationship with this disease, which all of us go through phases where it's good and bad. You can't get hung up on those what ifs because they'll destroy you. They'll eat you away, and it's impossible to stay positive if you sit around and think, especially the longer you have the disease, like, what if I hadn't had this, or what if this hadn't happened, or what if I hadn't made this decision, or what if I had decided to take this one instead of that one? Like, you can what if your life to death and get stuck in those circles. And it's impossible to stay positive through those. So, the best thing to do is just, be kind to yourself, be kind to the decisions that you've made as a person, and try to be positive. And I'm an extremely negative person. Like internally, or probably pretty real as a lot of people, like keeping it real. Like I like to keep it real, which makes me very, very negative at times. You can ask my girlfriend. She will tell you that I flipped the switch very, very quickly. Like that switch got flipped on Friday when like I got word that I'd been denied unemployment, and like that switch got flipped very, very, and it's like, we're gonna be fine. We're gonna make it. But like, it's like, I wasn't even thinking about myself then. I was like, well, what about the people that can't pay the bills and all these other people that don't have, and so like, she's like, you need to calm down. So it's somebody that can get very negative very, very quickly. I'm not somebody that wakes up and vomits rainbows and sunshine every single day. You have to stay positive. You have to stay positive and like force positivity upon yourself and upon like the people around you. And just because you're stoic, and it's like one thing that you are great at is like I know anytime like somebody's got something going on in like our group text message, like, you always, whether it's, whoever's got something going on, it's like you always slide in there with like something that's super positive and helpful. And, I've always appreciated that. And I think learning from you, like it can be very, uplifting to see somebody that's kind of stoic and also like capable of sharing their story and what they've been through and being honest about it, but also being able to like stay positive and like still just be willing to throw themselves to the wolves and grind out a really, really tough life and chase a dream kind of just, I don't want to say recklessly because like it's not smart for us to be reckless, but you have to, I mean, your world looks a lot like mine. You can get a last minute phone call and be on a plane in a day to take a job or get into a race, and you've got to make yourself available to that. And certainly this disease at times makes some of that a little tougher, but it's like, crap, man, we only get one of these chances at life as far as we know. So, and ours has been relatively tough in the first hopefully quarter of our lives, like it's already been tough. So we're going to, I think that's one thing that we've learned is like, you either give up or you really appreciate that we get to do what we love.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like sometimes that stoicism has been, at least for me, I've been too stoic at times, kind of like what I was talking about earlier. You can do it to a fault where you sometimes can be, you don't take a realistic view of the situation, but at the same time, and I mean, I think doing what we're doing now, there certainly has to be a lot of strategy and planning behind it. It isn't totally reckless, but in a lot of ways, though, I think what this is more than anything forced me to do, just from a self growth standpoint, aside from that initial forcing of growing up and maturing and getting into good habits, health wise and taking care of my body and being forced to kind of learn your body down to a T. I think the biggest thing that I can take away from the experience is just my ability now just to not really sweat the small stuff. And I think that's something that no matter who you are, it's a really good thing to try and practice. And it's also something that is a lot easier said than done. And it's something that I think we all struggle with, and I still struggle with it at times. But at least for me, and like I look at my career as an example, I've had some good breaks in my career. I've had some really bad breaks, and you realize that a lot of that stuff is just part of the process, and it also ties into your health. There are times you wake up feeling great. There's still times you feel you wake up and you feel like there's a 200-pound weight on your chest, and it's just going to be really tough to be productive that day. And I've just tried to keep that perspective though, and think about the whole idea of, look, ultimately, I'm not writhing in pain in that hospital bed in Milwaukee like I was in July of 2014. There's a lot of things I'm still able to do, and it's one of those things where even if I'm not totally 100% and I'm not going to ever be at my absolute peak again, the reality is being at 95% of that for a lot of people, I mean, really for anybody, still being at 95% maybe of your peak is still good enough, because it means you're still able to live life, and you're still able to do a lot of different things. And if you can kind of learn like the rest of that 5% that you can't do, if you can sort of figure out ways to mentally get around that, to kind of sort of trick yourself to help get those little adrenaline boosts, especially when you really need it, whether you're like for you when you're in a race, or for me when I'm on the air and you're trying to get past some of those other things. Like, to me, that's what's made a big difference and is kind of helped. And I do think I've gained some of that just from, like I said earlier, just from talking to patients and just realizing how fortunate I've been in the big grand scheme of things, and looking at it like from that overall perspective. But I also think, like, as a whole, and it's funny, I am mostly positive. I still have some occasions where inside I do think somewhat pessimistically, and I think what this whole process as well has made me realize is it's the whole concept that nobody outside of your core group, I mean, nobody really cares about what you're doing. What you're doing should matter to you. You should do what you love, do what matters to those closest to you. And I mean, having my disease, especially you realize the reality of it pretty quickly in a cutthroat industry like ours. And I'm sure it's the same for you, Brandon, where results and potential endorsements and spots on teams are determined by your times and not by how inspirational your story is. I mean, it's the same for broadcasting. Your gigs are determined on how your voice sounds and your delivery and how you sound in the big moments. And if you look presentable on camera, if your voice carries authority, it's not how did you overcome some sort of adversity in your life. So I've tried to just think of that and be like, look, nobody's going to feel bad for you. You just have to accept what already has happened and be appreciative of how you've been able to overcome that. And so we still have, as you were mentioning, we still have a lot of those hurdles. I mean, I still deal with a lot of sinus issues, which has been very frustrating on the broadcast perspective, because it kind of takes me back to those first feelings of sometimes not being able to fully project and trying to learn how to get around that on the air, which fortunately I've, over hundreds of broadcasts, you kind of learn all the little tricks and how to get the most out of your voice. But it's all something you kind of just you put into a big bag of thoughts and you try and keep present. So whenever you're feeling that way, but I've certainly felt fortunate to have you guys to bounce that stuff off of. And I just think back to our sitting around the pool at the 2017 symposium with you had your big tumbler of whiskey, Brandon, just sharing your whole war stories essentially. I remember being like, "Whoa, all right, that is that is out there." But I'm glad I'm hearing this from you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was one thing that was enlightening to me, because you're like trying to I kind of like equate it like in a movie when somebody's like sliding down the side of a cliff and they're just like trying to grab onto things to like stop them from falling, and that's kind of what you're doing before you get diagnosed, and like how you're still trying to just like grasp onto things of life, and trying to still be social and be kind of the person that I was before this happening. certainly created some stories. And I thought I was kind of probably crazy for doing them. And I honestly didn't really know any different, but like, I also didn't know I wasn't the only person that did those things. So certainly some of the stuff Kate's done, and some of the things that I've heard you talk about doing, I was like, oh, okay, there's other stupid people like me.
Yeah, well, we're all in the same boat in that regard. You know, until you meet somebody else, you kind of think you're the only one. And again, that's where our experiences, I think, they've been all mutually beneficial. I think Kate and Allison would agree with that.
Yeah, it's been, it's been fun. And like, I think back a lot to those moments out there, and you're like, yeah, okay, like these are people that get it, and these are people that I can say these things around. And because like we were talking about, kind of sort of with the stoicism thing, and not letting people in, and not letting people really know what's going on. It's like, part of that's because like you don't want to put something on somebody else that is like something that's super serious and kind of depressing at times, and very very heavy subject. And you certainly at some point in time kind of come aware of that. And we all have friends now that we can communicate with, like when stuff's just going completely sideways, we can make screwed up jokes, we can rag on each other, we can laugh about things that most people would probably find horrifying. Like, but we can all kind of like laugh off and shrug. And it certainly makes those difficult times a lot easier to bear when you got people to share stories and war stories with.
Right. Well, and it's certainly kept my own family close, like with my parents and sister. We to that extent, I mean, we still have some of those stories that a lot of people would be like, it would just sound so horrible, as far as going through that experience, but we can all kind of sit back and laugh about them now. And it's had kind of the same effect. And especially through, you think about a time like this, and where like my dad, he's back in Milwaukee right now practicing at his hospital, and he's been leading the Army Corps has been trying to construct a new field hospital for potential surge. So he's kind of in that realm, and we're kind of here, the rest of the family in San Diego. And it's definitely helped in that sense for times like this when it is tough. You have something to think back on and realize that, you've gotten through tough stretches before. You can do it again. And I know it's been nice to be around and sort of help my mom, who, she just retired last year, and she now has her own physician coaching practice that she does, and sort of to kind of gently remind her of that we've gotten through the stuff in the past. It's helped her, ease a little bit of the stress from having our family split up, and, having me with really no work right now, with all sports leagues in the country shut down. That can ease a little bit of that potential frustration.
Maybe next time I should have you do the play-by-play on my. I'll send the recorded video of my race, and you can do the play-by-play.
Yeah, I don't know anything about track other than kind of like Forrest Gump. You're just trying to run and do it for a long time. So I think
I was running.
Yeah, basically.
And he's still running, and he's still running, and he's still running. But luckily, my race is, give or take 4 minutes. A bad race, 4:10. A good race, like mid 350s. So it's not, it's not a marathon where you got to occupy a lot of airspace. But yeah, maybe we'll have to put that in action.
Yeah, you get in, you get out. It sounds better than I had a college baseball broadcast, SEC Network, last spring that was like 4.5 hours. So I mean, by contrast, this sounds a lot easier.
Yeah, you actually you talked me into last summer going to my first Major League Baseball game.
Yeah, we went to Twins A's. Had a great time. Target Field at the symposium.
Yeah, that was fun. It was more fun than I thought it would be, being somebody that has not been a baseball fan or been a fan of the sport or enjoyed playing it at all. I do enjoy throwing things, but I don't. Baseball never did it for me. But I was certainly glad to also experience that with somebody like you that can like explain everything that's going on and the intricacies of it, which I can appreciate. So
Well, that's my mission. Just a teach people about about life as a vasculitis patient. B, help people find enjoyment in new sports that they previously hadn't. Those are basically the two things.
Yeah. Well, it's probably, I think, a good place to end this here. I guess we've alluded to it a little bit. Tell people about where they can find you. Talk about your podcast just briefly with Kaylee and where they can find that at. And we will give the people's ears a rest.
Yeah, of course. Well, Kaylee Bynes and I, we co-host the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast through the VF. You can find that. You can just search Vasculitis Visionaries. You can find that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you prefer to listen. And we drop episodes every 2 weeks. And actually, Brandon, it mostly deals with medical professionals, but we have kind of a special COVID-related episode that we recorded a couple weeks ago with a bunch of the young adults that we know, just how everybody's handling and dealing with everything. And we're going to be dropping that actually next week. So you'll be able to, that'll be our next episode. So Brandon, you'll be the star in that. And as for my own stuff, you can go to I have a website with all my broadcasting content on it, benwilsonbroadcasting.com. So you can watch that and then roast me as much as you want for how bad I am on air. And I look forward to any of those comments are greatly appreciated. But more than anything, if you're going to pick one or the other, so subscribe to the Vasculitis Visionaries podcast, because I know it will it'll do us a lot of good, and it helps out, especially with trying to reach so many of the people in the medical community that we've done a good job of so far. I feel like we've had some really good episodes, and it's one of those projects that just started and is only continuing to grow.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly excited about it, and especially like there's finally some of these things in our space for us to have a voice and share with people and let people in, behind the closed doors a little bit of all of our lives, because I think it's something that has been needed for a long time. But I know for myself, and it's this honestly, like, break for the COVID stuff has given me a chance to catch up on some of these things. And I don't know if it's been like that for you, but
it's the only broadcasting I'm doing. Well, for the most part right now is the podcast. So yeah, it's helped me keep some skin in the game, so to speak. But yeah, it's been a fun experience, and it's been great to hear your podcast as well. As always, you've done a ton as well for our community. So that should not be ignored either.
Well, I think I honestly just do these so y'all can all just praise me and boost my ego even more than it needs to be done. And then just let Allison pop it.
Yeah, I respect the entrepreneurship that you've gone with.
It's a hustle, man. And like you said, you got to always be working. You got to always be refining your craft. And I think that's something that both of us have learned very well early in the game. And I think, hopefully we can look back when we're old men and be like, I made the right decisions in my 20s to start this path. So thanks, Ben, for coming on, and please go check out their podcast. If for some wild reason somebody on ESPN or ABC is looking for a budding young play-by-play announcer, give my boy Ben a shout.
There we go. Hey, appreciate it, man. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, Ben, we will, I'll definitely let everybody know when the new episodes and stuff comes out, and we will probably have you back on again at some point in time to discuss some of the other many things that we could spend hours discussing. So thanks again, Ben.
Yeah. No, I'm glad the recording worked this time. So that's good.